President Biden is praising a controversial prisoner exchange with Venezuela over the weekend. After months of negotiations, 7 Americans were exchanged for 2 convicted drug smugglers who have ties to the Venezuelan president. So Nancy Cortez is at the White House with more on this. So this kind of came as a surprise announcement, I think, for most people. What do we know about this deal, Nancy?
We know that this was in the works for months, if not a year or more, Anne-Marie, and it was an exchange, plain and simple, something the U.S. wanted in exchange for something that Venezuela's dictator wanted. And what the U.S. wanted was for 7 Americans to be freed in Venezuela, including 5 Houston-based Citgo oil executives who were detained back in 2017 on what the U.S. describes as bogus corruption charges. Venezuela agreed to the release in exchange for these 2 brothers who have been jailed for years in the U.S. for drug smuggling. And these aren't just any brothers, Anne-Marie. These are the nephews of the wife of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. CBS has learned the swap took place in the Caribbean nation of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And President Biden said in a statement this is part of his administration's unflinching commitment to keep faith with Americans held hostage and wrongfully detained around the world. But there are other politicians who argue that this strategy puts a price tag on the heads of Americans around the world. Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio, who's a senior member of the Foreign Relations Committee, he argued yesterday, now others know I can take Americans as a bargaining chip. U.S. officials argue this is a painful decision anytime they have to make it. There are still about 60 Americans who they say are wrongfully detained around the world, including basketball star Brittany Griner in Russia. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind for me, Nancy, was here you have 2 convicted drug dealers versus a handful of executives, and then, a basketball player, at least the exchange that was floated, was a basketball player in exchange for an arms dealer. Doesn't really seem like it's fair. I imagine that's part of the counter argument, but what's the argument in favor of these sort of exchanges?
The argument is that we don't know what happens behind the scenes, that there may be other promises that they are extracting from, the other side of the negotiation that we don't know about. And beyond that, they say it is simply the right thing to do to reunite these Americans with their families, particularly Americans who have been held for years in another country. They acknowledge that this does make things trickier, that it could create incentives for autocrats or bad actors to take more Americans hostage, to say, I'll just hold this American in reserve until there's something that I want, and then I'll negotiate. What U.S. officials argue is that they are prepared to impose other types of punishments, sanctions, other economic measures on countries that do this in order to make it more painful in an attempt to deter those countries from doing this kind of thing again.
All right, Nancy, thank you.
You're welcome.